What's up, guys? So we're going to be beginning brand new book called America's Paul Revere. Please pay attention to the reading. Here we go. All day, Mr. Revere worked in his silver shop at the head of Clark's Wharf in Boston. He made many beautiful things. He made buckles for gentlemen's shoes. He made rings for ladies' hands. He made many beautiful things. Mrs. Revere took care of her little house and the children, and she went to market and cooked the food and washed the clothes and made new clothes and swept and scrubbed the house. The family wasn't rich, but they had enough. Then, when the day's work was over, and people worked from sunrise to sunset every day but Sunday, the Reveres had a little time to themselves. So Mr. Revere would tell the children stories of his own childhood. He'd been born in a beautiful part of France called Midi, a sunny land of vineyards. And he was an ancient and respected Huguenot who had lived in stone houses on land that they owned themselves. But the king at the time did not like the Huguenots. And if they would not change their religion to suit him, they had to leave France. Here we go. That's again talking about that religious persecution. Thousands left for the Dutch lowlands, for England, and for America. Mr. Revere's parents could not leave, but they did want their son to grow up. And they did not want their son to grow up in a troubled country. So when he was 13 and big enough to look out for himself, they sent him away, knowing that they would never see him again. Mr. Revere told his children many times how he went first to an uncle in Guernsey, and then by himself he took a ship to America. As they sat around the fireplace serving winter evenings, eating apples and cracking nuts, Mr. Revere told his children many times how he went first to an uncle living on the English island of Guernsey. But across the ocean to the west was a great continent called America. Along the eastern seaboard were 13 busy English colonies. It was a new, uncrowded country, and a clever boy who learned a good trade and was ready to work hard might go far. The uncle found a ship which was going to America, so far away, so strange a land. He paid the boy's passage and gave the captain enough money to pay a silversmith for taking the boy into his own home and teaching him his trade. So he had come to Boston, and he had never seen his parents again. He had been homesick and frightened and lonely, and at first some of the Boston boys had laughed at his French accent. You see, even back then, people made fun of each other. But he had learned quickly how to speak English, and he had learned the silversmith's trade. Baptized the Paul Revere, I hope I said that right. He changed this to Paul Revere because he found the Yankees could say it more easily. And he had given this name to his oldest son, a squarely built boy, dark-eyed and ruddy. Now we call the name Revere. The father would look at his young son and smile. But once it was Revore, and in French, Revore means oak. The boy would smile back at his father. He knew his father meant, take the oak as your pattern of life, for it is a strong and useful tree. Now what he's really saying, guys, is he's saying, look at the oak tree and learn some lessons from the oak tree. It's a strong tree. It grows slow. It takes its time. Right? It's not in a rush. Not that it can help it, but you get my point. Right? Learn the lessons from the oak tree. Okay? There are many trees more showy than the oak, but none is so staunch and so honorable and so good. So again, that oak tree. There's many other prettier trees, but there's something about the oak tree that is powerful. Mrs. Revere, too, would tell her stories, for if they did not have any picture books, stories took their place in the Revere's children's lives. Her family, the Hitchborns, had been living about Boston almost ever since the town was a wilderness. An ancestor had been killed by the Indians, and another one was a famous captain of a ship and fought the pirates. And there were other stories, too. The children would hear of witches and demons, of Dick Whittington and his cat, of merry Robin Hood, and stories from the Bible. But by then, the little children would have been put to bed. Now all must go and be ready for work as soon as the sun rose the next morning. Mrs. Revere would cover the hearth fire with ashes. If her fire went out in the night, she would have to send Paul to a neighbor's to borrow some live coal. Mr. Revere would lock his shop and the doors of the house and perhaps let the dog in for the night and put the cat out. The father and the mother slept in a big bed, a couple of small children with them. Paul and his two younger brothers had a bed in the attic and across the hall. The last candle was blown out, and so they went to sleep. See, life was simpler back then. They didn't have all these distractions that we tend to have. They didn't have internet and TVs, and they lived life a little bit more simple, a little slower. They woke up, they went to work, they kept themselves busy, which reduced their stress in their life, and they weren't worried about much. They hunted, they went, they gathered, they got food, they lived simple lives. Outside the town, much kept guard in the crowded, crooked little streets of Boston. And down the length of Clark's Wharf, just behind the Revere's house, were ship watchers guarding the ships. If Paul woke in the night, he could hear the watch thumping their staves on the cobblestones, the bells of the ships telling the hour, the sea slapping idly among the piers of the wharf, and his parents snoring in the big bed. And he might hear squeak, squeak, and a tiny rustle of the little feet. And tomorrow night the cat had better sleep at home, whether she had a mind to or not. When Paul was 13, he became an apprentice to his father and worked all day learning to be a silversmith, even before his father, at the same time aged, had learned from the older smith. So, Paul Revere is learning a trade. And so what is a trade? A trade is maybe a carpenter learning how to build tables and chairs and working with wood. A trade could be learning how to, you can learn how to be a videographer, which is, a YouTuber. Somebody teaches you how to do something. That is a trade that you can do. You can learn how to be a cook. You can learn how to be a silversmith. Well, I don't know if they do that. They still do that, but you get my point. It's learning something. And so Paul was his apprentice, and he studied under his father, and he learned how to do this trade. Okay? And he was 13 years old. For Paul, as for most boys in 1748, schooling was over by the time they were 13. Wow. First, Paul had gone to a dame school where he was taught his ABC, a little reading, but not much writing. The children recited the alphabet together with quirks and quavers and were taught to bow and curtsy when spoken to and say yes ma'am and no ma'am. Children who did well were given cakes, but stupid children were made to stand in corners with dunce caps on their heads. Remember, I told you that this was like the early, the one room schoolhouse, and Let's see if we can see. We could see a picture right there of them sitting at that one-room schoolhouse. And remember, the child who would want to be the class clown would be put at the front of the room with the dunce cap on his head. Mischievous children were slapped and shaken until their teeth rattled. But such a school only cost their parents about 2 cents a week. When Paul was about 8, he had gone to a writing school and sat all day with the other boys on hard wooden benches. Besides writing and reading, he was taught to add and figure. Then his schooling was over. Anything more he wished to learn, he would have to teach himself. But Paul Revere went on learning all his life. And so those early years, you only went to school until you were a certain age. I think 13, they said, right? And so anything else he wanted to learn, he had to learn. So guys, take advantage of this opportunity that you have to sit in a classroom and learn information. Information is power. Knowledge is power. Here we go. Let's keep going. When he was 15 years old, Paul and 6 of his friends formed a society to ring the bells in Christ's church. There were many fine bells in the spires of Boston churches, but none were so famous nor fine as the 8 great bells in Christ's lofty spire. Bell ringing is a skillful art, and the boys agreed to practice once a week with a trained bell ringer, and then to ring the bells whenever the wardens of the church should wish. The 7 boys stood together on the second landing of the belfry. Each boy had his own great hemp rope to pull at exactly the right second. The first peal frightened pigeons flew in all directions from the great spire. What is a spire? A spire is a building that has a real pointy tip. And inside of there is a bell, and they would ring the bell to call people to go into the church. It was time for service. Okay, each boy had his own, okay, at the first, the pigeons would fly from the great spire, and then the music clamored and sang until the tower itself seemed to tremble. To the farthest ends of Boston, over the water of Charlestown or Cambridge, and to the ships at the sea came the golden ringing of the bells. And so at 15 years old, he is, he formed this society with his friends, and now he's a bell ringer for the church. Boston was bustling, it was crowded, it was a flourishing town, a great port. Its wealth was in its ships. So the way they got money was in the ships at the great ports. Let me show you this picture here. Okay? And you can see at the great ports all the ships, and that's how it got its money. From the West Indies, the ships brought molasses and sugar, raisins, limes, and oranges. From England, they brought paper and glass, fish hooks, metal tools, and tea, coffee, silk, and spices that they had bought from the Far East. Along the wharfs and in the warehouses, Paul could see these many things, and it really, really intrigued him. Some of the seamen brought parrots and monkeys home with them from other parts of the world, and all had tales of adventure. And Paul Revere is seeing all this in this bustling town called Boston, Massachusetts. Now, I myself have been to Boston, and Boston is it is a major city. It is alive. It is bustling. It is full of art and culture and history. And Paul Revere is part of that history. Okay. Okay. Here we go. You know what? That's good for today. So Paul Revere is part of this. So some of the things that we saw in the life of Paul Revere, forgive me, I think that we covered what we needed to cover, was the fact that he was somebody who comes from a simple life, right? His life was simple, but he and his family wanted to get out, but actually he ended up leaving because of religious persecution. But he also came to this place called Boston, Massachusetts, and he comes and he goes to school and he ends school at 13 years old, and he becomes an apprentice. Before that, he's an apprentice to his father as a silversmith, and he's learning trades and things. And so I would say to you that it is important to learn everything that you can learn from every teacher that is in your life, because there are going to be people in your life that are not necessarily teaching you in the classroom, but they're teaching you lessons in life. That makes you become an apprentice. You sit under somebody and you learn a trade, a craft. When I think of a trade or a craft, I think about, farming and running a farm and what that looks like. Not everybody can just walk in and start taking care of animals and making sure that they're fed and cleaning up and making sure that everything runs smooth. This takes a certain skill. Now, can anybody learn it? Probably anybody can learn how to do it, but it takes a skill. And that's what I'm saying, that every day you want to make sure that you're learning something new. And today we learned a couple of facts about the life of Paul Revere. I'll talk to you in a minute.